So the VA compensates for disability compensation for conditions that are found for mental health conditions, and those mental health conditions must be found in the Diagnostics Statistics Manual, or the DSM. And there's different variants every few years. The psychological field and the experts therein, they create a new medical publication that guides all professionals for the diagnoses that can be assigned and the symptoms found with those diagnoses. Perhaps we have new diagnoses. For example, PTSD is a newer mental health diagnosis. Historically, the VA and individuals in society have called what we call PTSD, they've called it a soldier's heart. They've called it shell shock. There's a host of names that have referenced symptoms that we now call PTSD. The only thing we see consistently is that we had the symptoms remain the same, that people who serve in a combat environment over and over again have these very specific hyperarousal, irritability, maybe they become reclusive in nature. But one thing that's interesting is, so we're talking about mental health conditions, the VA had a penchant for calling everything a personality disorder from the 60s and the 1970s and the 1980s, and even midway through the 90s. There was a stigma associated with mental health, and there weren't as many psychologists. We had more psychiatrists back then, but rarely did you have a diagnosis. Some of the diagnoses are laughable. When you look at some of these professionals' diagnoses, you'll see something that will just say nerves. But the common one that you see there again is personality disorder. And the reason these professionals diagnose personality disorder is because the VA refuses, by law and statute, they will not compensate for personality traits and personality disorders. So when the mental health professionals during that period diagnosed those conditions, that was their way of saying, I know they won't get anything for this personality disorder. Despite the veteran coming back and being admitted inpatient for mental health conditions, they would still just give a diagnosis. The VA representative would give a diagnosis of personality disorder. And still today, by law, personality disorders are not compensable for VA disability compensation. Now, where you have argument and wiggle room is saying this was never a personality disorder. The veteran was diagnosed with a condition found in the DSM-IV, both before and after the diagnosis of the personality disorder. And so there's wiggle room to argue a host of things there, and oftentimes we'll send them to a mental health professional or a psychologist to get an opinion stating that that previous diagnosis was invalid and that it should have been what was later diagnosed, which might be a PTSD or something similar, a depressive disorder, a major depressive disorder, but not a personality disorder. And so to the veterans who have had diagnosis of personality disorder, and specifically to the veterans who have been diagnosed by C&P examiners with a personality disorder, it's something you certainly want to consider appealing, and we've been very successful in that regard.